Hi, I'm Reggie Turner. I'm here with Jim Miller and Terrence Moore. FlipSide starts right now. Welcome to the show. Tonight we are joined by Senator Paul Corderman. How are you tonight, sir?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me this evening.
Good. It's glad for you to be with us. Session is over. You have a little downtime, but that downtime doesn't really last long, now, does it?
I think it all depends how you define downtime.
I was going to say.
I mean, yes,
you're making up for the 3 months you were gone, right?
Exactly. So the legislative session has concluded, as we are all aware. It's a 90-day session in Annapolis, which is where the real work happens as far as state legislation. But the work never ends, as you guys all know, and everyone knows the work never ends. And during the interim, as we call it, there's countless hours of meetings and constituent issues and challenges, and then truthfully preparing for the next session, because the way Maryland General Assembly is, it is that small window of 90 days, and so you need to be prepared when you go back there and have all your ducks in a row for when the next session comes. So that's what we're in the process of doing here now.
Well, can we start there? Can you talk to us about the structure and hierarchy of Maryland government?
Sure. So, I mean, the Maryland General Assembly, it's a great question, too, because quite honestly, before I really got involved in this, 6 years going on 7 now, it's, if you're not really in it or paying attention to it, it's a lot of individuals don't really have the subject knowledge of how that, how the flow is. So I think what you're getting at is, obviously, everyone knows we have a governor, the executive branch. And then in the legislative branch, in the General Assembly, there's the Senate and the House. And so when you have a piece of legislation, a bill, it has to pass both chambers to then go to the governor's desk. Now, the governor can either sign the bill, he can veto the bill, or he cannot do anything, the bill just passes. So a lot of the power really does reside in the chamber of the General Assembly between the House and the Senate. But with the bill, it has to go through the same process on both sides. There's a first reader where the bill is introduced and it's right across the floor. Then it's assigned to a committee, and that is really where a lot of the work happens in the General Assembly, is through the committee. The committee structure is heavily relied on in the General Assembly. There are 4 standing committees in the Senate, 6 standing committees in the House, and so the bill is assigned to one of those committees. And it goes to the committee, and that's where you have your hearing. You have a committee hearing. I'm assigned to the Budget and Tax Committee. When I was in the House, I was on the Appropriations Committee, which is basically the sister committee between the two chambers. But the piece of legislation gets heard in that committee, and then it has to get out of the committee to go back to the chamber. And there's a couple of different ways that can happen. It can either be voted favorably. You had your bill was presented. The committee felt that it was an important piece of legislation to move forward, and they passed it. It could be voted favorable with an amendment. Obviously, hey, we like this idea, but there's some tweaks and some changes need to be made. And that happens a good bit. It could be voted down. It's like, we don't like this bill, we're going to vote it down. And then the one that I found the most interesting, which I actually wasn't aware of before I really got involved in state politics, nothing can happen. And that's up to the chair. They don't have to take a vote on it. So you have many, many bills that are introduced in Annapolis, hearings are held, and there will be no action taken. There will be no vote taken one way or another. And when that happens, it essentially has died in committee because it can't come out of the committee if it doesn't have a vote. And if a vote hasn't been called, essentially it's not moving anymore, obviously. But it has to come out of that committee to go back to the chamber. And when it goes back, that's when it goes to second reader. And that is where it can be, again, debated, amended by the entire body of the chamber, whether it's in the House or the Senate. Once it passes that second reader, it goes to a third reader, which is kind of the last opportunity. It's basically the vote up or down on the bill as it stands after it's been amended and everything. Typically, it is very rare that you'll see a bill come out of committee that does not then pass on the floor. As we're all aware, the makeup of the Maryland General Assembly is, on both sides, on both the House and the Chamber, they are heavily favored to the Democratic side, and so they control all the committees. They control, the Speaker's positions as well as the President's position. So they're not going to have bills move forward unless everyone's kind of on the same page. I say it's rare. It has happened. I have seen in the Senate, since I've been a member of the Senate the last 3 years, where a bill has died on the floor. It didn't happen this year. I remember it happened twice last year. I never saw it happen in the House, but it is a rarity when that happens. And that's not specific to Maryland. You find that in most bodies, whether it's state or even the federal level, whoever is in majority, they're not going to let things come out of the committee that aren't going to pass on the floor, because at that point, it's almost what are we doing? That's where in the committee structure is you really get into the details, the weeds of it, so to speak, to get into all the issues and things of that nature.
So there were, around 3,000 bills that were introduced?
It's about 3,000 bills that are drafted.
How many of those actually came out of committee?
So out of committee, I'd have to check the exact numbers on there. I think there was about 1,000 bills passed. So it's probably in that range, because pretty much everything that comes out of committee. Now, at the very end, sine die, the day before, where you really get a crunch time, there are bills that didn't get passed at the very end just because it ran out of time. And then a lot of times those bills will be back the next year. Or, quite frankly, there is, or the right word here is, there are bills also that, for politics per se, they want to move them along to a certain point, but they don't want to get them entirely over the finish line. So they may put them out late just to kind of test the temperature of the water, so to speak, and see how it's going to go, but not ready to move them to a full vote. But again, it's more of a timing thing. The last day or two, being in the minority party that last day, there's a lot of debate and a lot of discussion that happens that day, because it's basically a race against the clock on both sides of trying to move things forward. And we don't have a filibuster in Maryland. They can call for a vote, but generally there'll be an ample amount of time for debate before that happens. But there are certain times it doesn't. We saw an example of that with some pieces of legislation we may get into later this evening.
Is it fair to say that a bill that goes through first read and ends up in a committee, regardless of debate in the committee or hearings, is it fair to say that sometimes, maybe often, the committee chair already knows whether they're going to stick it in the drawer and not let it go anywhere before that even happens?
Well, I think it depends on when you say it's fair to say. I think there's an idea. As not just myself, but anyone who's been involved for a while, you can get a pretty good feeling each day, like when I see the agenda of bills we're going to hear. You can pretty much quickly determine, almost just by reading the title of the bill, a brief synopsis of it, and or even the sponsor of the bill, of where this bill may or may not be going. So I think the chair has a pretty good gauge from the jump as far as what may or may not be moving. It also depends on the subject matter of the bill. There's again, you talk about thousands of bills that are drafted, hundreds of bills that are passed. We, as the general public, generally only hear about half a dozen, maybe 10 bills, which is a very obviously small number in the grand scheme of things. You have local delegation bills that every jurisdiction has for a variety of different things. So depending on the magnitude of what the bill does or does not do, I think also determines as far as its path forward and the ability for it to move forward.
Is there recourse if the committee chair decides to stick it in the drawer? Is there recourse of any type that the preponderance of the members, and they probably wouldn't if they're all in the same party, but is there recourse to get a bill
So there is, if you have a certain number, you can request bills to be brought to the floor. We had that number previously in the Senate. When I say we, as the minority party, I'm a Republican. But honestly, Jim, it's a lot of it is that's the power of the chairman, the chairwoman. The power of the chair gets to make that determination of what comes up for a vote, what doesn't come up for a vote. And I think a lot of there's a lot of discussion within the leadership of the particular chamber, whether it's the House or the Senate, amongst those leaders, amongst those chairs. Whether it's the president or the speaker's office and so on and so forth. But the simple answer is no, there's not much recourse of any.
Interesting.
I have a lot of pictures on my phone.
Sure.
One picture is from 2016. Downtown, that evening, you're elected to city council.
Mm-hmm.
In less than 7 years, you've been through a lot.
Mm-hmm.
You've become delegate.
Mm-hmm.
You've come into the senator seat.
Mm-hmm.
You've run multiple campaigns in that short stint, when some people have probably only ran one, if any, during that time.
Yep.
You dealt with a pandemic,
Mm-hmm.
business owner,
Mm-hmm.
still raising, your family and obligations to family, and
Sure.
giving up a large portion of your time to service, because even though legislation is in for 3 months, it is a year-long job of staying connected. That's a lot to pack into a short time frame in a political career. And on top of that, go through two iconic governors right now in moments, and also a shift in the party. What's wrong with you? That's a lot.
You put it out there, it's like, what am I doing? Who signed up for it? So, at the beginning, so let's go back to 2016. And so it's a very common question people ask as far as, why would you do this? Or why did you get involved in this? Or things of that nature. And the simple thing is, to me, it's to be involved and to be able to be a part of that public service for our community. I was born and raised in this community. I've lived in a variety of areas of the state, but I came back to this community about 12 years ago. And where it first started is I got involved in a local neighborhood group. My wife was actually on Main Street when it was first enacted in the city of Hagerstown. She was one of the chairs of Main Street. And, she was the chair, or one of the, I guess, co-chairs. And, I was just the side, piece, so to speak. But then we got involved with a neighborhood group and, started to go to those neighborhood meetings and things of that nature. And then, like you said, I ran for city council in 2016. I never thought in my, wildest dreams per se, or whatever, however you wanted to call it, that, we'd be here today talking about, as you just articulated very well, that path over the last 7 years. That was never the intent. And people then still ask me now, like, well, what are you going to do next? I'm like, well, I don't know. I was like, I ran for city council. That was the objective here, was to get in the city council and, be involved and help our local community, hopefully, move forward. A variety of things happened in that short amount of time. Not in addition just to those, you brought those 3 elections, there was also 2 Central Committee appointments. So I think I went through 5 processes. But I understand what you're saying as far as it's a lot. I got to tip my hat obviously to my wife and support system at home. I think anyone will tell you if you don't have a strong support system at home, none of this is possible. She's tremendous, support to not only myself but our daughter, as you said. I have a young daughter, and so I could never do any of this without her. But it's a challenge. As you said, it's not a part-time job. It's defined as a part-time job here in Maryland because it's the Maryland General Assembly when it meets for 90 days. But it is nothing. It's not a part-time job. Those 90 days are as full-time as it gets. And even outside of that, today, we're meeting here today having conversations about this particular job, that I do. But I probably handled, half a dozen calls related to different matters within our community, emails, things of that nature, setting up meetings and things of that nature. So it's full-time all the time. But it's, I appreciate, how you laid it out there. And I don't know what I'm thinking sometimes, but here we are.
Sounds like you got a new campaign manager.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think you can probably count on Terrence's vote next time.
We didn't talk about Gordon's. We didn't talk about the stadium. There's a lot of. If you had to title your book, I don't know. You probably have trouble finding out what's the title going to be.
And it's challenging because I was having breakfast with someone this morning. We were talking about that balance, and it's hard. And we all have these things in our lives. You guys are all wear multiple different hats in our community and are involved in a variety of different things, and you try to focus on one thing, and then it's like, well, I'm not giving enough attention to the other thing, and then you move over here, and sometimes you feel like it's pop-a-mole almost sometimes. And so it's tough to balance, but at the same time, the reward on it to me is being able to help our community. That's what it comes down to me, and I stress this to people all the time, and I would call on you guys here and the viewers at home, if at some point, and it's an if, because I don't ever think it's going to get there, but if at some point people don't view that I'm doing this for the right reasons, I hope that people would come and kind of grab me by the neck and say, what are you doing here, Corderman? Because there are certain individuals, and I won't say where or who or what, whether it's local or state or federal or anything, that get involved in politics sometimes for, I won't say the wrong reasons, but I don't know what the reason is. Mm-hmm. I never got involved in this to be council member or delegate, a senator. I got involved in this to help our community and try to bring things back to our community and help move our community forward and be able to engage and have conversations with the community on all different levels to be able to accomplish that. I didn't do this to have some sort of title. There's individuals out there that do that. They want to be the senator. They want to be the, whatever.
They want the title.
They want the title.
Yeah.
And
I don't think anybody is ever going to accuse you of that.
Yeah, well, I would hope not. But I do. Look, I'm a strong proponent of feedback. I'm a strong proponent of having those conversations with people and surrounding yourself by people from all ways of life, so that way you can get a good grasp of feedback from everybody. And so I call on everyone in the community that when things seem to be going a certain direction that someone may or may not be happy with, well, please reach out to me. I'm readily accessible and things of that. So
that's absolutely true. I can say from personal experience, whenever I reach out, it's minutes sometimes before only minutes till you respond. And I can also say, and we talked about this a little bit offline, but with a combination, and this is a document you sent me, and I know you send that out to a number of people. You post things on Facebook and social media. You send emails out. The transparency in what you bring to this community and what you do for this community, good, bad, or indifferent. I mean, I know I've read things in your that say, hey, this happened. I'm not necessarily for it, but this is what's going on. I think that transparency is exactly what we need, and I wish there were some national politicians that would adopt your style of service. Personally,
I appreciate that. I think a lot of it's just the way of the world, and to your point, I think hopefully more of our colleagues would do that on all levels of government. But you have to be engaged in social media now. Instagram, Facebook, things of that nature.
But a lot of politicians engage in social media as gotcha
True.
media, and here's what the other side's doing. I've never seen that post from you, not once.
I try to stick basically factual on a lot of things.
Yes, you do.
Right, wrong, or indifferent. This is what happened.
Which is why you're a FlipSide fave. We like the facts.
Right, regardless of politics, whether it's a Democratic idea, Republican idea, or who opposes or supports it. This is what happened.
Yeah, and and the question shouldn't be what is a Democratic or Republican. The question is it a good idea or is it not a good idea?
Right. And we can all debate the merits of those ideas, and that's what we should be doing collectively, as a society. And that's the beauty of the American democracy. We should be able to, unfortunately, especially on the federal level, we've gotten a little bit away from that, but we should be able to sit down with difference of opinions, different backgrounds, have those conversations, even if they're difficult conversations, because you got to have them.
Absolutely.
If you don't have them, it's just only going to get worse. But you have those conversations and work through those things to the best of your ability. There's certain things that there's certain things that I may believe in or feel that are totally different than what you believe and feel, and that's okay. But if there's opportunities that we can work together to move past and build upon and make things better, well then we owe ourselves that. And so,
local businessman, talking about your commitment and all that you do. A local businessman who's now passed, who was an amazing community citizen. His and I know it's not originally his saying, but Mike Callis used to always say, "The world is run by those who show up." And I think you typify what that means. You clearly show up, not only in Annapolis, but coming back here and doing the work you do. Because clearly, once you leave the 90-day session, some of what you do is optional. You could choose to ignore it, and you don't.
Yeah, like I said, that goes back to then why are we doing this? Why am I putting myself through all these different things? Because, I truly am in this to try to do what's right for our community and the individuals who live here.
Getting back to the structure, though, there's a Western Maryland delegation. Sure. I'm sure there are other delegations.
Yep.
How does that impact what you do?
So, the Western Maryland delegation. Let's just hone in on that. So, the actual Western Maryland delegation is everything from Carroll County west. Depending on where you live, people will debate where Western Maryland starts and ends. The folks in Carroll County say Western Maryland starts in Carroll County. You go out to Garrett County, they may agree that Allegheny County is part of Western Maryland, but anyways, so those 5 counties make up the Western Maryland delegation. And as you said earlier, there are multiple delegations throughout the state, whether they're regional delegations. We also have here locally, we have the Washington County delegation. And that is made up of 6 members because we have 2 of our members represent portions of Washington and Allegheny County, and that's in Senator McKay and Delegate Baker with the District 1. So there's a variety of delegations, throughout the state. Depending on, what types of legislation are being pushed, usually on a more regional one, like the Western Maryland delegation, because you have such a broad base of communities, you won't see a specific bill or legislation being supported by the Western Maryland delegation per se. You'll see those more here local delegations, a lot of Washington County delegation, Allegheny County. For example, here locally, the liquor board. The liquor board wants to change something. All the liquor laws in Maryland all have to go through the General Assembly. And so if the liquor board wants to change something, they bring it to the local delegation, the Washington County delegation, and and that is then submitted as a local delegation bill that Delegate Wyville's office puts in on the House side, and then we will cross-file to our office will on the Senate side. And so they'll be submitted as Washington County delegation in the House, Washington County senators in the Senate. And we had a handful of those this year as well.
Interesting.
Senator Corderman, I want to go back a little bit because you talk a lot about community participation, and you crave that, you look for that participation and feedback. Going back to talking about committees, talk about how your constituents can participate in that process, because obviously there's testimony, and since COVID, that testimony can be in person. Is Zoom still an option for testimony as well?
Yes, it is, and so that's a great point. Senator Edwards used to speak about that a lot. Every time I heard him speak, he always would end it with "be involved." And I think to your question about being involved, there's a variety of different ways to do that. So when a bill is heard in a hearing, that is an opportunity for people to submit testimony, and you can do it exactly what you said: written testimony, oral testimony in person, or there's also the option to Zoom in, which they kept that option even after the COVID. Just being honest, cards on the table, being there in person is by far and away the most impactful.
Right.
Now, it's a challenge where we live. Obviously, we're an hour and a half, 2 hours away, maybe more depending on traffic. It takes your whole day. But I'm telling you, when you are in a committee hearing and individuals show up in person and it was important enough for them to take time out of their day, from their business, from their job, from their families to come to Annapolis, so they're that passionate about it, it means something.
It's a level of commitment.
There's a level of commitment. There's passion in it. Written testimony, it helps, don't get me wrong. It's a good kind of gauge, almost thermometer to kind of gauge, as we're saying, the temperature of the water maybe of a bill. Like a bill will come to the committee, I'll immediately go to the committee testimony and do a quick scan of, because it'll have all the letters will be listed there, and they'll say if they were for the bill or against the bill. And you get a pretty good feeling like, oh man, there's 20-some letters here that are for this bill and none against it, or vice versa. Now, again, also depending on what the subject matter of the bill is and who are the advocates that are supporting that. Zoom is a viable option, but again, just being honest, when I think anyone will, well, maybe they won't tell you, maybe I shouldn't tell you, but when it comes on Zoom, I think it's just the nature of Zoom. It's not as engaging.
Right. Right.
And so, do people have the ability to do that? And I would never, tell someone not to do it if that's the only involvement, the only way they can be involved, because by all means, we want people to be involved. But if you have the opportunity and can come to Annapolis to speak in person, I mean, the weight that provides, you can't make up for it. Not to mention, the hearing is only part of it. So the hearing, just like anything in life, where we're talking politics, we're talking business or personal, there's the meeting before the meeting, there's the meeting after the meeting. And so when you come to Annapolis, you have the ability to have that. You have the ability to step out in the hallway, maybe have a quick conversation with the chair, have a more of a relaxed conversation that's not, under the lights per se. You can maybe meet with a subcommittee chair and meet with some other members and have some personal dialogue that can go, look, all this is relationship building, just like anything in life, whatever we're talking about. Again, business, politics, personal, whatever it may be. And so if you can develop those connections and connect with an individual in an individual, way, it is so much more impactful.
So another question, and I know we're taking a long time on this segment, but I'm okay with that because this is good conversation.
I told you what happened.
Yeah, exactly. and our producer was back there snapping his fingers like, you're at 20 minutes. Well, guess what? We're going over 20 minutes. Talk to me about how state government collaborates with the federal government, with the county government, with the local municipalities in some cases. Talk about that.
So that's a great question, Jim. From what I have seen from my experience, you have a lot of collaboration in the local levels up to the state. Not as much the federal. You do have some. Our office is in constant communication with Congressman Trone's office. We have a great relationship with his office. 81 funding, which we were all concerned about. The Congressman and I spoke multiple times about that as a joint effort to make sure that we can try to protect that money. And we were able to do that. And I give him, I tip my hat to him for his help on that also, because it is, you need everyone on the same page and things like that. Haven't had as much collaboration with Senator Cardin's office or Senator Van Hollen's, but again, they have the whole state. So it's with some of their people in their office have. Back to the local level though, I mean, between I represent District 2. District 2, just so reviewers know, is the eastern half of Washington County and the northern portion of Frederick County, and that changed here most recently. Within District 2, I'd say the largest municipality is the city of Hagerstown. We have constant collaboration with the city of Hagerstown, with our county commissioners. Even in Frederick County, we've met with the town of Thurmont and Emmitsburg. So a lot of collaboration between the local and the state. I think that's something we need to work on a little more, quite honestly, with some of our federal colleagues. But I think that's just a prime example of there's always opportunities to work on things. But I think it's just the nature of it to a certain extent. I don't think it's anything different in our area than it is so much across the state. I just think you see a lot more collaboration between your local and your state as opposed to you do all the way up to the federal.
State to federal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Interesting.
It's been described that in Annapolis, Democrats have a supermajority.
It hadn't been described. That's the
That's an accurate description.
I was going to let you stamp that.
That's all right. Yes. Yeah.
Sure. So obviously, there was a lot of change. It was a slow start out of the gate for the Moore administration. A lot of things have changed. I know a lot of things are still changing. What have the challenges for you been being in the minority party?
So the state of Maryland, as we talked about earlier, and you just said there, it is where we live in Western Maryland. If we're in our own little bubble, people think this is, it's conservative, and Washington County is for the most part, and Western Maryland obviously is. But the state of Maryland as a whole is as blue as you can get. I mean, we joke sometimes in Annapolis that it's California on the Bay. And that's just the reality of it, so to speak. I'm not trying to be disrespectful on it, but that's what our state makeup is as an entire state. Between the two bodies, it is a supermajority in both the House and the Senate. They can pass any bill they want. They can override any veto they want. You saw that repeatedly during the Hogan administration. Bills would pass, the governor would veto them. They had the ability to flip them, and when they did, pretty much every single time. As far as myself individually, I think it goes back to some of what I was talking about earlier. It's relationship building.
Yes.
It's connecting with individuals on an individual basis, on a human level, and be able to have those connections and be able to work through. Again, I don't sound like a broken record. I've said this multiple times, but it's whether it's business or politics or personal, you have to be able to connect with individuals. And when you connect with individuals and you develop those relationships, then you can, cut through some of that, cut through the politics per se. And again, a majority of the things in Annapolis are not partisan. There are partisan things, don't get me wrong. And again, those are usually the half a dozen or 10 bills that we see on the nightly news, whether it's, some of the ones that were up this year.
Wage.
Yeah, minimum wage, the family leave, or cannabis, or gun issues, abortion issues, those hot button issues, those clickbait issues, so to speak. Yeah, those are partisan issues, and there are certain things that I'm not going to change my mind. My colleague across the aisle probably going to change their mind, but there's so many other issues that we can work on collaboratively that if you can meet people and at a level of respect between each other, and even in those tough conversations, deal with it with a level of respect and be able to move forward. Look, I see down there time and time again where individuals on both sides, whether you're Republican or Democrat, will get up and just spit and fire, and it doesn't get you anywhere. It might be good for a YouTube clip or something like that, or this or that.
And that's why they do it, probably,
it is,
in some cases.
At the same time, there are certain issues that people are very passionate about, so I don't want to take away from that because it isn't always that. But a lot of times it's some showmanship, maybe some gamemanship. It's politics per se. Being in the minority party, back to your question, I try to cut through a lot of that, and I try to meet people for who they are, develop those relationships, and really, in our neck of the woods, so to speak, a lot of individuals again that hold that majority are not from our area. Again, I've referenced Senator Edwards before, but I mean that man was there for 40 years, so he had a wealth of institutional knowledge, and I heard him say a couple of times, kind of on his swan song, so to speak, when he was leaving the last year or so. He said, when I came to Annapolis, the numbers were different, but the crux of look around the room and there's X amount of Democrats and Y amount of Republicans, and he said, I've learned real quick, I need to make some friends. I need to make some Democratic friends, because if you want to get things done in Annapolis, in the state of Maryland, that's just the reality of what it is. And we've been able to do that. I feel over the last 6 years, and from in the House and then coming over to the Senate, be able to build those relationships and be able to, I think that it's evident in some of the successes that we've had of some of the resources we've been able to bring back to our community, some of the pieces of legislation we've been able to pass by doing that. And so, that it kind of sums up to me, it's all about relationships and having those.
Well, and I would
relationships.
argue that your approach and your thought process, you mentioned earlier about some that are there for the title and others that are there to make a difference. I think you being there to make a difference really probably helps you build those relationships, even if somebody is diametrically opposed to your politics.
Yeah, I think people, look, we're all human. People can see through some of those things, and they can see things
you
that
can
are
see
genuine.
yeah, exactly.
And so I think there's a level of respect that's gained on both sides as you're having those conversations, and how you conduct yourself, and
Right.
in whatever manner that may be.
Well, and I think Senator Edwards,
Sure.
had the same kind of approach, at least from my vantage point.
Yeah, my short time there, Terrence, you went through that kind of those 6-7 years, and the city council, which that was the goal to get to city council. I was only there a little over a year when all this then rolled down to the state, and I had a tremendous amount of support when I got there, and as I've been there with Senator Serafini, Senator Edwards, and some of our other delegates. The interesting thing is now, and I said it at one of the legislative sessions, and it's not to toot my horn by any means, but now I am the most senior member of the Maryland State Senate west of
Time
Carroll
flies.
County, because there was a complete changeover, in Frederick. There was a complete changeover in basically all the counties west. So at the same time, back to your point there, Jim, it's that short time I had with some of those individuals, and I continue those relationships. Senator Serafini especially. He's a tremendous mentor and support to me. And I communicate with him often. I joke, my political advisor checked out about 10 years ago or so I had to go find a few other ones, and that was my dad. But Serafini, he's been tremendous, and Senator Edwards, and I have a lot of other colleagues. We're, I say, fortunate. Right through the county of the west was in Allegheny County. Delegate Buckle, who's probably my closest friend in Annapolis, he's the House Minority Leader, on the Republican side, and he represents an area of this part of the state, and so he's tremendous support as well. So again, it's surrounding yourself with good people to be able to give you that feedback and kind of move forward. So
We're going to keep it going, or are we going?
Do you have another question?
Of course, we had a lot more questions.
Have at it.
In politics, you got to pick your poison.
absolutely.
And I know you talk about relationships, and everyone has to be heard and understood, and you gotta play both sides. You gotta be cordial, but sometimes you gotta rub people the wrong way, and to do it in the best interest of the majority. Ultimately, there's the R or a D, all constituents you represent. Correct.
Absolutely. Yep.
You've picked your poison in supporting the business community a lot. Tell me a little bit why you've gone in that direction and some of your challenges with doing so.
So I think there's multiple kind of levels to answer that question. So one, I'm a small business owner myself, but before even that, before I had my own business, go back a couple years, I think it's Paul Fry with the Chamber. It says it often when he goes and speaks. It's the business community that comes in and uplifts a lot of the community. I think it's a combination. There's multiple spokes in the wheel, but what I like to see is the government kind of entice the business community, entice that private investor. Again, we'll probably get to it at some point, but you talk about the ballpark, the project downtown, that's a significant amount of investment the state is making in a specific area. But part of that is it will ignite and put basically a stake in the ground to the business community of like, this is important, this is going to happen, and then it helps that community then move forward, the business community that is, and the developers and individuals of that nature to be able to go in and kind of do their thing and do their investments, do their developments, because it all then compounds as far as, all right, let's roll it back here a little bit. Government, obviously, is there to provide support to our community, to our individuals, things of that nature, and that's obviously going to cost money. And what I'm getting to is generating revenue. So if you're going to generate revenue, you need to either increase your taxes, or you're going to increase your tax base.
Exactly.
Well, to increase your tax base, which is more the side that I'm on, taxes are a necessary evil. But to increase that tax base, you really need that business community to step in to fill that, I don't say gap or void, but to do that engagement, to be able to, again, use that downtown project, which we're hopeful is going to happen as far as the residual effects from it, of the property values go up. So when the property values go up, what happens then? There's more additional revenue comes into the city coffers, to the county coffers.
Not to mention additional businesses, restaurants.
Additional businesses, which then creates more employees, which creates more income tax, which then goes back to the county. And so, to me, the business community is the stimulus to help bring those revenues in that we need. Because look, nobody wants to pay taxes, but we all have to pay taxes because we need government to provide those necessary components of fire and police and schools and water and those things.
Infrastructure.
And
Yep.
so infrastructure and all those things. So yeah.
I would say the most fired up I've seen you relative to the business community was last year during campaign season, and the president of Wright Gardner had was very adamant about the challenges downtown, and we can put an asterisk by that because he has chosen to leave. That, but you on social media, there was a little bit of a dust up, but you were really adamant in fighting for the business community around public safety. Talk about your feelings about that and
So,
the challenges
and that
behind
specific
that.
thing, because that's kind of segues into public safety. You know what I mean? As far as, so in that particular situation, it had to do with a lot of the challenges that we face, not just in the city of Hagerstown, but in communities all across the state, with the opioid epidemic and individuals that are, overdosing on public streets and cars and parking lots and people's doorways and things of that nature. And I was very vocal and still stand by that as far as, in our state, it's just the direction that our state has gone has been, more on a real rehabilitative approach, which I'm not opposed to. I don't think most people are opposed to. But at the same time, have kind of shied away from any type of accountability. I'm all for helping people. We want people to get help. We want people to rehabilitate themselves. We want people to be members of a successful member of our society. At the same time, there has to be a certain point in time where if an individual chooses not to do that, they don't want to better themselves, they don't want to get better, they continue to be a detriment to society, whatever manner that be, there has to be some sort of accountability. And what we have seen over the years with a lot of the legislation that's been passed in the General Assembly, that we've gotten away from that, particularly in that realm. And it's a tough one because look, addiction is a very tough subject. I think anyone in this room here right now, anyone who's watching at home, all knows someone that's addicted or has been addicted to some substance, whether it's alcohol or drugs or what have you. And it's a very challenging thing. At the same time, though, there has to be a balance. And I think right now those things are imbalanced. And I think what Mr. Wright was upset about, and understandably so, is there was repeated incidents of individuals having these incidents at his place of business, and the police are like, well, there's nothing we can do about it because in the state of Maryland we've decriminalized the possession of drug paraphernalia. We've decriminalized the possession of certain drugs under certain amounts. We've decriminalized a variety of things, and so the police, they can come and try to be like move along, so to speak, but there's real no accountability or consequence to the individual who continues to reoffend to a certain point.
Yeah, I grew up in New York City during the crack epidemic.
Sure.
And I think we probably overcorrected. I think that during that time it was all criminalized.
Yep, I think you're
and
right.
now I agree that it is a health issue, but I agree with you that there has to be some balance. And when I seen that dust up online, it was more so you fighting for the business community to voice themselves and not be attacked for doing so.
Right.
It wasn't about one way was right, one way was wrong. It was that we all have a voice and we all have an opportunity to speak up and hold our elected officials accountable for doing what's best for us and making sure we're being heard.
Sure.
And we see it right now. I just seen the paper now. They're asking people to put cameras outside their homes downtown in some of these areas so they can help the police police. So I think constituents, it should fall on, there should be a balance of responsibility, but mainly towards our elected officials to create an environment for us to be safe as well as healthy.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, I think it's incumbent on the elected officials to hear that, to hear both sides,
Yes.
to hear both sides of the individuals that may be more on the rehabilitative side, and some of the individuals that may be on the other side, and find that
bridge.
that bridge to bring that balance that you spoke to.
Collaboration, yes.
Yep.
Paul, let's take a break here. We want to come back and talk about the session wrap up. And I want to apologize because we went long and we didn't have red Solo cups here to enjoy while we were talking. But stay with us though.
Okay.
Stay with us. We'll have more with Senator Paul Corderman after the break. Welcome back to the show. We're still joined by Senator Paul Corderman. Paul, thank you for staying with us. Paul, when I look at this session and just how things are moving in the state, even though there is a Democratic supermajority, I like to look at it as the legislature and the Moore administration are watering the seeds that Governor Hogan planted in regards to our community. How do you see this particular legislative session?
So I think there's kind of a couple questions in there that right when I heard you ask that my mind goes to. So I think you had obviously the legislative session. We'll get into that as far as maybe some specific bills per se that either I sponsor as a whole that came out of the legislation. But then you talked about the Moore administration also. And then obviously the Moore administration, it was their first year here, and I think it was taking them a little while to kind of get their legs under them. They brought in a variety of different individuals from all walks of life, so to speak. Some that had legislative experience, the majority that did not, and so I think there was just a learning curve going on there with them, as well as it's the honeymoon period. I mean, it's regardless of what governor it is, I mean, the governor doesn't actually become the governor until about a week and a half into the session.
Right.
Is when they actually get sworn in. And so that first session, they may have some specific ideas that they had on their campaign trail, but they really haven't had the opportunity or the ability to sit with their staff and to meet with the leaders of the General Assembly of, all right, what is our mission? What are we really crafting to push forward? And so I think that's what, to me, is what's going to be interesting, what's going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years. Because the first year you have is kind of that honeymoon year. The last year, well, that's your campaign year.
And the first year, if you speak to it, the Moore administration was starting out with Hogan's budget.
So what happens is, so Governor Hogan, they put the budget together. It is a recommended budget.
Right.
Because the budget, again, it's a $60 billion budget. I mean, they send us these books, it's like this big. So there's no way that a new governor would be able to put all that together right away. However, at the same time, the governor does have the ability, the incoming governor, to make changes, make tweaks, things there. And he did. He did that in a variety of things. Most notably, you saw that with capital. Governor Hogan, when he went out, he had made a press conference about some recommendations for some particular funding source locally. There was $10 million that was recommended to go to the med school at Meritus. And there was probably about 50 or 60 projects statewide. And what happened is, so the governor made that recommendation, Governor Hogan that is, and so you had a lot of entities that figured they were good. Hey, Governor Hogan has recommended, again, use Meritus as an example, we're going to recommend to get $10 million. Heck, the governor had Dr. Joshi come down to Annapolis and had a picture of him and it was in the newspaper. But then when the new administration comes in, this isn't anything about Meritus per se, because again, this happened to probably about 60 or 80 projects. The new administration pretty much just took that and just wiped the slate clean. And quite frankly, I don't fault them for that, because they are the governor now, it's their administration, and they put a solicitation out, so to speak, during the session of, hey, if you would like to apply, we're going to have some supplemental funding here, and if your priorities align with our priorities, maybe this is something we can move forward for. And I think that's you become the governor, that's your right and your ability to do that. It did cause some issues, I think, not just here locally, but statewide, with some entities that thought maybe they were going to get some funding and didn't get it, and vice versa, and things of that nature. But then you talk about also, the legislation itself it came out of the legislature. Big ticket items we talked about a little bit before of, I like to say, you couldn't have had a more sometimes inflammatory group of topics. I mean, we had guns, drugs, and abortion were front and center. And so when we speak about that, you had SB 1, which was the wear and care, bill. You have, abortion to enshrine that in the state constitution, and you had cannabis, which, the voters legalized cannabis overwhelmingly. So it was up to the state then to put in a implementation process to that and what that would look like. And so those were 3 huge things. On top of that, we talked about minimum wage. The governor, that was a priority of Governor Moore's administration, to accelerate minimum wage. Minimum wage passed a couple years ago with almost like an escalator,
right?
To get up to $15.
Was it 5 years?
About 5 years, maybe 6, depending on the size of your establishment. The very small businesses, I think, got an extra year, so it was either 4 to 5 or 5 to 6. I'd have to double check that to be certain. But anyways, it was an escalator.
Right.
But Governor Moore came in and said, nope, we're gonna change that. Everyone's going to 15 starting January 1. He also had an original piece of legislation tied to it, the CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index, also known as inflation. That, quite frankly, made myself very uncomfortable, made a lot of colleagues on my side of the aisle uncomfortable.
And some Democrats
Democrats, yeah. I think across the board, I shouldn't say, just Republicans, I appreciate you saying that, because ultimately that piece was stripped out of the legislation.
Right.
You see that in other things. Most notably, we see that in our gas tax.
Yeah.
As most folks are aware, if you're not aware, your gas tax is going to go up next month to the tune of about 5 cents, and that happens automatically because I have to check the year, but it was about 8-10 years ago in the General Assembly when they passed the gas tax legislation. They added the CPI to it, so it never had to be revisited again.
Yeah, so-
anytime inflation goes up.
And there are some
there's-
things that just shouldn't be on autopilot.
Yeah, and exactly. And I agree with that, Jim. I think, quite frankly, regardless, especially when you're talking about taxes and raising fees and things of that nature, they should be discussed on the merits of the individual tax, the circumstances that surround it. Again, whether you're talking gas tax or income tax or property tax, I'm not a fan of seeing something tied, as you said, put on autopilot. And that's essentially what they wanted to do to minimum wage.
And also the economic conditions.
And we're still reeling from
Right.
2020. So there's a lot of uncertainty in the economic climate right now as well.
And when you talk about, we've all talked about the business community and being a small business owner myself, that's a very tough thing to forecast for.
100%.
I mean, you understand it. I mean, it's tough enough. I mean, I think the reality is people, whether you agree or disagree, $15 was happening. Okay, it was out there. It was happening.
Right.
It was happening in a year or two, whatever. It was happening. And so right now it's at 13.25. So businesses have been able to kind of prepare for that and ramp up and look at it, forecast and look at their revenues and their projections and plan for it. I think you tie that CPI to it. That's tough. How do you know if this year it's going to be $15? Next year it might be $18. It might be $50. Who knows? So I think to your point, Reggie, I think you're 100% right. I think on both sides of the aisle, I think that was just a little bit too far. And so that came back. But those are just some examples of some big pieces of legislation that went through, under the Moore Miller administration and under the guidance of the General Assembly.
You sponsored a number of bills in this session, and a number of them passed. Obviously, some of them didn't. Talk to us about the ones that have passed that you think our viewers would be interested in.
So there's a couple of them, actually, Jim. So one, I think, which is when we talk about economic development and we talk about our part of the state. We were talking about Western Maryland before. So a year ago, we were able to get passed what's commonly referred to as the George Edwards Fund. So as we know, George Edwards was a senator in Garrett County for many years. He had tried this bill for a number of years to basically pull together a pot of money that can only be spent for the three westernmost counties, Washington, Allegheny, and Garrett, for economic development. And that bill, I'd been involved in it for at least 3 years, and we were able to finally get it over the finish line last year. And I think it helped that George was leaving. I think to a certain extent. Let's be honest here. I think
Tip of the cap.
Tip of the cap. He'd been trying for it, and if you're going to do it, there was no other better time to do it than George was leaving. And so much so they renamed the fund for George, because originally it's called like the Western Maryland Economic Investment Fund. And they named the fund for him and honor him and his commitment to this part of the state. But it's $50 million. $50 million can only be spent in these three counties to spur economic development, to spur job growth. What happened during that push for that legislation over the first couple of years, the focus has been so much on the money. We gotta get the money, we gotta get the money, we gotta get the money for the fund. Between myself, Senator Edwards, Delegate Buckle, I spoke with him before, of getting the fund. And not as much thought process had gone into kind of the makeup of the board and how that would work and how the distribution of the funds would be handled and things of that nature. There was a construct of a board, and that board met here this last year, and they vetted some projects and have put some money out. But we kind of revamped that this year. Myself and Delegate Buckle, we sat down, we met with the board that was currently there, and kind of revamped that piece of legislation. The money was the same, so now we kind of focused more on the structure of that board and how it will perform going forward. We're going to bring in an executive director to manage the fund. The money itself gets managed through Tri-County Council. That's who actually gets the fund, but an executive director, that their sole job would be to market this fund, to go out and seek those investments to be made in these counties, because right now it's a great group of individuals that are on this board, but again, many of them wear multiple different hats and they're doing multiple different things, and so we're going to see a more of a singular focused commitment on that. So that passed. I think that's big.
And is that fund replenished?
So that fund, what was passed last year, it was $20 million the first year, with $10 million each additional year for another 3 years. So it's $50 million spread over 3 years. Spread over 4 years, technically. And so the hope and goal is to be successful in that and to continue that, and that's what that was the conversation we had with the existing board of, look, we can put $20 million out on the street and give it to a bunch of different entities, but if it doesn't move the needle one way or another, what are we doing here?
Right.
And what are we doing then going forward? Because if we're successful with it, we can get back to Annapolis. I'm confident in my abilities, the networks, the relationships we built, we can go back, say, look, you gave us $50 million the last 3 or 4 years. This is what we did.
Right.
We brought this, we got this, this is what's happening. We're rolling. Give us some more money, you know what I mean?
Similar to what you did with the historic tax credit.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
ROI.
yep, exactly. That return on investment. Absolutely right. But if we don't succeed in that, and we just, aren't successful, we'll just be polite. And, well, then, your opportunity to gain more funding and continue that momentum, it's not as likely.
Yeah, and you shouldn't throw good money after bad.
No. So, that was a big one. The tax sale revision with the city of Hagerstown, that was a collaboration with the city of Hagerstown and Cumberland and the town of Frostburg, with taking some of the blighted properties, and be able to have an opportunity for the city to be involved with those. Home Improvement Commission bill we had, that was actually one that was a local constituent candidate. I think it's a great example of collaboration. We talk about being transparent, being accessible to our community. It was a constituent reached out to our office, was involved in a situation with a contractor who basically took their money and didn't complete the work, and he made a claim with the Home Improvement Commission, but there's only a certain amount of money in the fund, and only a certain amount can be dispensed per claim on each individual case. And this contractor, unfortunately, has all across the state done this, and so he wasn't able to be compensated or reimbursed for some of his losses. And so we were able to increase that fund, and so it was really a consumer protection bill. And then, the economic development bill is with regards to sports entertainment facilities. As we all are aware, there is a multi-use sports entertainment facility being built in downtown Hagerstown. Last year, there was two pieces of legislation that were passed in regards to sports facilities, aka stadiums. One was specific to the city of Baltimore, basically for Camden Yards and Raven Stadium, which was $1.2 billion. That the stadium authority would manage that for improvements to those facilities at whatever time that was needed. They developed a second pot of money. It was $200 million for the other facilities throughout the state, a la Frederick, Bowie, Delmarva. What happened when that piece of legislation was put through last year, the Hagerstown facility unintentionally was left out, because the way the bill was written last year, it said the facility had to be owned and operated by a city, county, or state government, because that's what every facility is in the state of Maryland, except for what the Hagerstown facility will be. So we were able to go back, and it was basically a technical fix, so to speak, is how it was presented, to include the Hagerstown facility. So if and when the time comes that additional funding is needed, they would have the ability to tap into that as well. Because again, if that money is out there for those facilities, we want to make sure that our facilities be able to, reap those benefits as well.
We've only got about 2 minutes left in the show, but in those last 2 minutes, can you tell us what didn't happen in Annapolis this year that you think is a miss?
So to me, the number one thing that did not happen is crime and public safety. And that we could probably have a whole show on that by itself. It is repeatedly the number one issue in the state of Maryland by voters. The Gonzales poll came out yesterday. The Goucher poll that came out a month ago. Crime and public safety is always number one. Now, how do you define what you're doing for crime and public safety? That's debatable, and again, I'm sure we could take a show for that. But there was no real meaningful pieces of legislation that passed that had to deal with crime. In those same polls, I don't want to say everything's based on polls, but they're a good, barometer, especially when you have overwhelming evidence. If it's a 50-50 thing, that's different. But when you have 80-90% of individuals that say that's the number one issue in the state of Maryland, those same individuals, 77%, I think it was the most recent poll, favor prosecuting repeat violent offenders. Okay, we're talking repeat violent offenders again. So you stick a gun in someone's face not once, but twice or 3 times. I think that goes back to there has to be some accountability. And a majority of people, regardless of politics, think that is appropriate. Yet, in the General Assembly, we failed to do that. We have repeatedly introduced a bill to make possession of a stolen firearm a felony. Again, supported by over 75% of Marylanders, regardless of party affiliation. So I think, to me, I think that's the biggest thing that didn't happen, is addressing public safety. I'm hopeful that we'll see how that goes, going forward with the Moore administration, as well as with both the leaders in the House and the Senate. But when that repeatedly is the number one thing and we fail to act on it, I think we're doing a disservice to our constituents and our communities that we're there to represent.
Got it. Well, that's all the time we have for this show, but we are very appreciative of you coming and breaking down how things happen in Annapolis, how our constituents can be involved in the process, and some of the important takeaways from this session. So thank you much for joining us.
No, I appreciate that. And if I can just add one last thing, feel free to, we touched on it earlier, I'm readily accessible, Instagram, Facebook, email, website. Reach out to me, whatever I can do to help out.
Stop by the store.
Absolutely.
Well, that's all the time that we have for tonight. We hope that you'll like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. Send us your comments to feedback@theflipsidetv.com. That is feedback@theflipsidetv.com. Most importantly, join us again next week for another episode of The Flipside. It's